Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Hey, wildlings. You gotta know that every time you betray a relationship, when you cheat, when you abuse, you're going to get caught. See, there's an old saying about how it's possible for three people to keep a secret. Well, this is a little bit like that. Just more effed up, and much more demonic. Continuing on, tonight's story, The Hellbound Heart, by Clive Barker, parts 8 and 9. There was thunder that night, a storm without rain which made the air smell of steel. Kirsty had never slept well. Even as a child, though her mother had known lullabies enough to pacify nations, the girl had never found slumber easy. It wasn't that she had bad dreams, or at least none that lingered until morning. It was the sleep itself, the act of closing the eyes and relinquishing her control of consciousness. That was something that she was temperamentally unsuited to. Tonight, with the thunder so loud and the lightning so bright, she was happy. She had an excuse to forsake her tangled bed, drink tea, and watch the spectacle from her window. It gave her time to think as well. Time to turn over the problem that had vexed her since leaving the house on Lodovico Street, but she was still no nearer to an answer. One particular doubt nagged. Suppose she was wrong about what she'd seen. Suppose she'd misconstrued the evidence and Julia had a perfectly good explanation. She would lose Rory at a stroke, and yet, how could she remain silent? She couldn't bear to think of the woman laughing behind his back, exploiting his gentility, his naivete. The thought made her blood boil. The only other option was to wait and watch, to see if she could gain some incontrovertible evidence. If her worst suppositions were then confirmed, she would have no choice but to tell Rory all she'd seen. Yes, that was the answer. Watch and wait. Wait and watch. The thunder rolled around for long hours, denying her sleep until nearly 4. When finally she did sleep, it was the slumber of a watcher and a waiter, light and full of sighs. The storm made a ghost train of the house. Julia sat downstairs and counted the beats between the flash and the fury that came on its heels. She had never liked thunder. She, a murderess, she, a consorter with the living dead. It was another paradox to add to the 1,000 that she'd found working in herself of late. She thought more than once of going upstairs and taking some comfort with the prodigy, but she knew that that would be unwise. Rory might return at any moment from his office party. He would be drunk on past experience and full of unwelcome fondness. The storm crept closer. She put the television on to block out the din, which it scarcely did. At 11, Rory came home, wreathed in smiles. He had good news. In the middle of the party, his supervisor had taken him aside, commended him for his excellent work, and spoken of great things for the future. Julia listened to his retelling of the exchange, hoping that his inebriation would blind him to her indifference. At last, his news told, he threw off his jacket and sat down on the sofa beside her. "Poor you," he said. "You don't like the thunder, do you?" "I'm fine," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes. Fine." He leaned across to her and nuzzled her ear. "You're sweaty," she said matter-of-factly. He didn't cease his overtures, however, unwilling to lower his baton now that he'd begun. "Please, Rory," she said. "I don't want this." "Why not? What did I do?" "Nothing," she said, pretending some interest in the television. "You're fine." "Oh, is that right?" he said. "You're fine. I'm fine. Everybody's fucking fine." She stared at the flickering screen. The late evening news had just begun, the usual cup of sorrows full to brimming. Rory talked on, drowning out the newscaster's voice with his diatribe. She didn't much mind. What did the world have to tell her? Little enough. Whereas she had news for the world that it would reel to hear, about the condition of the damned, about love lost and then found, about what despair and desire have in common. Please, Julia, Rory was saying, just speak to me. The please demanded her attention. He looked, she thought, like the boy in the photographs, his body hirsute and bloated, his clothes those of an adult, but still, in essence, a boy, with his bewildered gaze and his sulky mouth. She remembered Frank's question, how could you ever have married such a dullard? Thinking of it, a smile creased her lips. He looked at her, his puzzlement deepening. What's so funny, damn you? Nothing. He shook his head, dull anger replacing sulk. A peal of thunder followed the lightning, with barely a beat intervening. As it came, there was a noise from the floor above. She turned her attention back to the television to try to divert Rory's interest. But it was a vain attempt. He'd heard the sound. What the fuck was that? Thunder. He stood up. No, he said. Something else. He was already at the door. A dozen options raced through her head, none of them practical. He wrestled drunkenly with the door handle. Maybe I left a window open, she said, and got up. I'll go and see. I can do it, he replied. I'm not totally inept. Nobody said she began, but he wasn't listening. As he stepped out into the hallway, the lightning came with the thunder, loud and bright. As she went in pursuit of him, another flash came fast upon the first, accompanied by a bowel-rocking crash. Rory was already halfway up the stairs. It was nothing, she shouted after him. He made no reply, but climbed on to the top of the stairs. She followed. Don't, she said to him, in a lull between one peal and the next. He heard her this time, or rather chose to listen. When she reached the top of the stairs, he was waiting. Something wrong? He said. She hid her trepidation behind a shrug. You're being silly, she replied softly. Am I? It was just the thunder. His face, lit from the hall below, suddenly softened. Why do you treat me like shit? He asked her. You're just tired, she told him. Yeah, but why though? He persisted, childlike. What have I ever done to you? It's all right, she said. Really, Rory, everything is all right. The same hypnotic banalities over and over. Again, the thunder, and beneath the din, another sound. She cursed Frank's indiscretion. Rory turned and looked along the darkened landing. Hear that? He said. No. His limbs dogged by drink, he moved away from her. She watched him recede into the shadow. Lightning, spilling through the open bedroom door, flashlit him, then darkness again. He was walking toward the damp room, toward Frank. Wait, she said, and went after him. He didn't halt, but covered the few yards to the door. As she reached him, his hand was closing on the handle. Inspired by panic, she reached out and touched his cheek. I'm afraid, she said. He looked round at her woozily. What of? He asked her. She moved her hand to his lips, letting him taste the fear on her fingers. The storm, she said. She could see the wetness of his eyes in the gloom, little more. Was he swallowing the hook or spitting it out? Then, poor baby, he said. Swallowed, she elated, and reaching down she put her hand over his and drew it from the door. If Frank so much as breathed now, all was lost. Poor baby, he said again and wrapped an embrace around her. His balance was not too good. He was a lead weight in her arms. Come on, she said, coaxing him away from the door. He went with her for a couple of stumbling paces, then lost his equilibrium. She let go of him and reached out to the wall for support. The lightning came again, and by it she saw that his eyes had found her and glittered. I love you, he said, stepping across the hallway to where she stood. He pressed against her, so heavily there was no resisting. His head went to the crook of her neck, muttering sweet talk into her skin. Now he was kissing her. She wanted to throw him off. More, she wanted to take him by his clammy hand and show him the death-defying monster that he'd been so close to stumbling across. But Frank wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not yet. All she could do was endure Rory's caresses and hope that exhaustion claimed him quickly. "Why don't we go downstairs?" she suggested. He muttered something into her neck and didn't move. His left hand was on her breast, his other clasped around her waist. She let him work his fingers beneath her blouse. To resist at this juncture would only inflame him afresh. "I need you," he said, raising his mouth to her ear. Once, a lifetime ago, her heart had seemed to skip at such a profession. Now, she knew better. Her heart was no acrobat. There was no tingle in the coils of her abdomen. Only the steady workings of her body. Breath drawn, blood circulated, food pulped and purged. Thinking of her anatomy thus, untainted by romanticism, as a collection of natural imperatives housed in muscle and bone, she found it easier to let him strip her blouse and put his face in her breasts. Her nerve endings dutifully responded to his tongue, but again, it was merely an anatomy lesson. She stood back in the dome of her skull and was unmoved. He was unbuttoning himself now. She caught sight of the boastful plum as he stroked it against her thigh. Now he opened her legs and pulled her underwear down just far enough to give him access. She made no objection, nor even a sound as he made his entrance. His own din began almost immediately, feeble claims to love and lust, hopelessly tangled together. She half listened and let him work at his play, his face buried in her hair. Closing her eyes, she tried to picture better times, but the lightning spoiled her dreaming. As sound followed light, she opened her eyes again to see that the door of the damp room had been opened 2 or 3 inches. In the narrow gap between the door and the frame, she could just make out a glistening figure, watching them. She could not see Frank's eyes, but she felt them, sharpened beyond pricking by envy and rage. Nor did she look away, but stared on at the shadow while Rory's moans increased, and at the end one moment became another, and she was lying on her bed, with her wedding dress crushed beneath her, while a black and scarlet beast crept up between her legs to give her a sample of its love. "Poor baby," was the last thing Rory said as sleep overcame him. He lay in bed still dressed. She made no attempt to strip him. When his snores were even, she left him to it and went back to the room. Frank was standing beside the window, watching the storm move to the southeast. He had torn the blind away. Lamplight washed the walls. "He heard you," she said. "I had to see the storm," he replied simply. "I needed it." "He almost found you, damn it!" Frank shook his head. "There's no such thing as almost," he said, staring out of the window. Then, after a pause, "I want to be out there. I want to have it all again." "I know." "No, you don't," he told her. "You've no conception of the hunger that I've got on me." "Tomorrow, then," she said. "I'll get you another body tomorrow." "Yes, you do that. And I want some other stuff. A radio for one. I want to know what's going on out there. And food. Proper food. Fresh bread. Whatever you need. And ginger. The preserved kind, you know, in syrup." "I know." He glanced round at her briefly, but he wasn't seeing her. There was too much world to be reacquainted with tonight. "I didn't even realize it was autumn," he said, and went back to watching the storm. The first thing that Kirsty noticed when she came round the corner of Lodovico Street the following day was that the blind had gone from the upper front window. Sheets of newspaper had been taped against the glass in its place. She found herself a vantage point in the shelter of a holly hedge from which she hoped she could watch the house but remain unseen. Then she settled down for her vigil. It was not quickly rewarded. 2 hours and more went by before she saw Julia leave the house. Another hour and a quarter before she returned, by which time Kirsty's feet were numb with cold. Julia had not returned alone. The man that she was with was not known to Kirsty, nor indeed did he look to be any likely member of Julia's circle. From a distance he appeared to be in middle age, stocky, balding. When he followed Julia into the house, he gave a nervous backward glance, as if fearful of voyeurs. She waited in her hiding place for a further quarter of an hour, not certain what to do next. Did she linger here until the man emerged and challenge him then, or did she go to the house and try to talk her way inside? Neither option was particularly attractive. She decided not to decide. Instead, she would get closer to the house and see what inspiration the moment brought. The answer was very little. As she made her way up the path, her feet itched to turn and carry her away. Indeed, she was within an ace of doing just that when she heard a shout from within. The man's name was Sykes. Stanley Sykes, nor was that all that he'd told Julia on the way back from the bar. She knew his wife's name, Maudie, an occupation, assistant chiropodist. She'd had pictures of the children, Rebecca and Ethan, provided for her to coo over. The man seemed to be defying her to continue the seduction, but she merely smiled and told him that he was a lucky man. But once in the house, things had begun to go awry. Halfway up the stairs, friend Sykes had suddenly announced that what they were doing was wrong, that God saw them and knew their hearts, and found them wanting. She had done her best to calm him, but he was not to be won back from the Lord. Instead, he lost his temper and flailed out at her. He might have done worse in his righteous wrath, but for the voice that had called at him from the landing. He'd stopped hitting her instantly and become so pale that it was as if he believed God himself was doing the calling. Then Frank had appeared at the top of the stairs in all his glory. Sykes had loosed a cry and tried to run, but Julia was quick. She had her hand on him long enough for Frank to descend the few stairs and make a permanent arrest. She had not realized until she heard the crack and snap of bone as Frank took hold of his prey how strong he'd become of late. Stronger, surely, than a natural man. At Frank's touch, Sykes had shouted again. To silence him, Frank simply wrenched off his jaw. The second shout that Kirsty heard had ended abruptly, but she read enough panic in the din to have her at the door and on the verge of knocking. Only then did she think better of it. Instead, she slipped down the side of the house, doubting with every step the wisdom of this, but equally certain that a frontal assault would get her nowhere. The gate that offered access to the back garden was lacking a bolt. She slipped through, her ears alive to every sound, especially that of her own feet. From the house, nothing. Not so much as a moan. Leaving the gate open in case she should need a quick retreat, she hurried to the back door. It was unlocked. This time she let doubt slow her step. Maybe she should go and call Rory, bring him to the house. But by that time whatever was happening inside would be over, and she knew damn well that unless Julia was caught red-handed, she would slide from under any accusation. No, this was the only way. She stepped inside. The house remained completely quiet. There was not even a footfall to help her locate the actors that she'd come to view. She moved to the kitchen door and from there through to the dining room. Her stomach twitched. Her throat was suddenly so dry she could barely swallow. From dining room to lounge and thence to the hallway, still nothing, no whisper or sigh. Julia and her companion could only be upstairs, which suggested that she had been wrong, thinking she heard fear in the shouts. Perhaps it was pleasure that she'd heard? An orgasmic whoop instead of the terror that she'd taken it for? It was easy to make that mistake. The front door was on her right, mere yards away. She could still slip out and away, the coward in her tempted, and no one be any the wiser. But a fierce curiosity had seized her, a desire to know, to see the mysteries that the house held and be done with them. As she climbed the stairs, the curiosity mounted to a kind of exhilaration. She reached the top and began to make her way along the landing. The thought occurred that now the birds had flown, that while she'd been creeping through the back of the house, they'd left out the front. The first door on the left was the bedroom. If they were mating anywhere, Julia and her paramour, they would surely be in here, but no. The door stood ajar. She peered in. The bedspread was uncreased. Then a misshapen cry, so near, so loud that her heart missed its rhythm. She ducked out of the bedroom to see a figure lurch from one of the rooms farther along the landing. It took her a moment to recognize the fretful man who had arrived with Julia, and only then by his clothes. The rest was changed, horribly changed. A wasting disease had seized him in the minutes since she'd seen him on the step, shriveling his flesh on the bone. Seeing Kirsty, he threw himself toward her, seeking what fragile protection she could offer. He had got no more than a pace from the door, however, when a form spilled into sight behind him. It too seemed diseased, its body bandaged from head to foot, the binding stained by issues of blood and pus. There was nothing in its speed, however, or the ferocity of its subsequent attack that suggested sickness. Quite the reverse. It reached for the fleeing man and took hold of him by the neck. Kirsty let out a cry as the captor drew its prey back into its embrace. The victim made what little complaint his dislocated face was capable of. Then his antagonist tightened its embrace. The body trembled and twitched. Its legs buckled. Blood spurted from eyes and nose and mouth. Spots of it filled the air like hot hail breaking against her brow. The sensation snapped her from her inertia. This was no time to wait and watch. She ran. The monster made no pursuit. She reached the top of the stairs without being overtaken, but as her foot descended, it addressed her. Its voice was familiar. "There you are," it said. It spoke with melting tones, as if it knew her. She stopped. "Kirsty," it said. "Wait a while." Her head told her to run. Her gut defied the wisdom, however. It wanted to remember whose voice this was, speaking from the binding. She could still make good her escape, she reasoned. She had an 8-yard start. She looked round at the figure. The body in its arms had curled up, feetally, legs against chest. The beast dropped it. "You killed him," she said. The thing nodded. It had no apologies to make, apparently, either to victim or witness. "We'll mourn him later," it told her, and took a step toward her. "Where's Julia?" Kirsty demanded. "Don't you fret. All's well," the voice said. She was so close to remembering who it was. As she puzzled, it took another step, one hand upon the wall, as if its balance was still uncertain. "I saw you," it went on, "and I think you saw me at the window." Her mystification increased. Had this thing been in the house that long? If so, surely Rory must... And then she knew the voice. "Yes, you do remember. I can see you remember." It was Rory's voice, or rather a close approximation of it. More guttural, more self-regarding, but the resemblance was uncanny enough to keep her rooted to the spot, while the beast shambled within snatching distance of her. At the last she recanted her fascination and turned to flee, but the cause was already lost. She heard its step a pace behind her, and then its fingers were at her neck. A cry came to her lips, but it was barely mounted before the thing had its corrugated palm across her face, canceling both the shout and the breath it came upon. It plucked her up and took her back the way she'd come. In vain she struggled against its hold, the small wounds her fingers made upon its body, tearing at the bandages and digging in the rawness beneath, left it entirely unmoved, it seemed. For a horrid moment her heels snagged the corpse on the floor. Then she was being hauled into the room from which the living and the dead had emerged. It smelled of soured milk and fresh meat. When she was flung down, the boards beneath her were wet and warm. Her belly wanted to turn inside out. She didn't fight the instinct, but retched up all that her stomach held. In the confusion of present discomfort and anticipated terror, she was not certain of what happened next. Did she glimpse somebody else, Julia, on the landing as the door was slammed, or was it Shadow? One way or another, it was too late for appeals. She was alone with the nightmare. Wiping the bile from her mouth, she got to her feet. Daylight pierced the newspaper at the window here and there, dappling the room like sunlight through the branches, and through this pastoral the thing came sniffing her. "Come to Daddy," it said. In her 26 years she had never heard an easier invitation to refuse. "Don't touch me," she told it. It cocked its head a little as if charmed by this show of propriety. Then it closed in on her, all pus and laughter and, God help her, desire. She backed a few desperate inches into the corner until there was nowhere else for her to go. "Don't you remember me?" it said. She shook her head. "Frank," came the reply. "This is Brother Frank." She had met Frank only once, at Alexandra Road. He'd come visiting one afternoon just before the wedding. More she couldn't recall, except she'd hated him on sight. "Leave me alone," she said as it reached for her. There was a vile finesse in the way its stained fingers touched her breast. "Don't!" she shrieked, "or so help me—" "What?" said Rory's voice. "What will you do?" Nothing was the answer, of course. She was helpless as only she had ever been in dreams, those dreams of pursuit and assault that her psyche had always staged on a ghetto street in some eternal night. Never, not even in her most witless fantasies, had she anticipated that the arena would be a room that she had walked past a dozen times in a house where she had been happy, while outside the day went on as ever, gray on gray. In a futile gesture of disgust, she pushed the investigating hand away. "Don't be cruel," the thing said as his fingers found her skin again, as unshooable as October wasps. "What's to be frightened of?" "Outside," she began, thinking of the horror on the landing. "A man has to eat," Frank replied. "Surely you can forgive me that." Why did she even feel his touch, she wondered? Why didn't her nerves share her disgust and die beneath his caress? "This isn't happening," she told herself aloud, but the beast only laughed. "I used to tell myself that," he said. "Day in, day out. Used to try and dream the agonies away. But you can't. Take it from me, you can't. They have to be endured." She knew that he was telling the truth, the kind of unsavory truth that only monsters were at liberty to tell. He had no need to flatter or cajole. He had no philosophy to debate or sermon to deliver. His awful nakedness was a kind of sophistication, past the lies of faith and into purer realms. She knew, too, that she would not endure, that when her pleadings faltered and Frank claimed her for whatever vileness he had in mind, she would loose such a scream that she would shatter. Her very sanity was at stake here. She had no choice but to fight back, and quickly. Before Frank had a chance to press his suit any harder, her hands went up to his face, fingers gouging at his eye holes and mouth. The flesh beneath the bandage was the consistency of jelly. It came away in globs, and with it a wet heat. The beast shouted out, his grip on her relaxing. Seizing the moment, she threw herself out from under him, the momentum carrying her against the wall with enough force to badly wind her. Again, Frank roared. She didn't have time to waste enjoying his discomfort, but slid against the wall, not trusting her legs sufficiently to move her into open territory toward the door. As she advanced, her feet sent an unlidded jar of preserved ginger rolling across the room, spilling syrup and fruit alike. Frank turned toward her, the bandaging about his face hanging in scarlet loops where she'd torn it away. In several places the bone was exposed. Even now he ran his hands over the wounds, roars of horror coming as he sought to measure the degree of his maiming. Had she blinded him? She wasn't sure. Even if she had, it was only a matter of time before he located her in this small space, and when he did, his rage would know no bounds. She had to reach the door before he reoriented himself. Faint hope. She hadn't a moment to take a step before he dropped his hands from his face and scanned the room. He saw her, no doubt of that. A beat later, he was bearing down upon her with renewed violence. At her feet lay a litter of domestic items. The heaviest among them was a plain box. She reached down and picked it up. As she stood upright, he was upon her. She loosed a cry of defiance and swung the box-bearing fist at his head. It connected heavily. Bone splintered. The beast tottered backward and she launched herself toward the door, but before she reached it, the shadow swamped her once more and she was flung backward across the room. It came at her in a raging pursuit. This time he had no intention beyond the murderous. His lashes were intended to kill. That they did not was a testament less to her speed than the imprecision of his fury. Nevertheless, 1 out of every 3 blows caught her. Gashes opened in her face and her upper chest. It was all that she could do to prevent herself from fainting. As she sank beneath his assault, again she remembered the weapon she'd found. The box was still in her hand, and she raised it to deliver another blow, but as Frank's eyes came to rest on the box, his assault abruptly ceased. There was a panting respite in which Kirsty had a chance to wonder if death might not be easier than further flight. Then Frank raised his arm toward her, unfurled his fist, and said, "Give it to me." He wanted his keepsake, it seemed, but she had no intention of relinquishing her only weapon. "No," she said. He made the demand a second time, and there was a distinct anxiety in his tone. It seemed the box was too precious for him to risk taking it by force. "One last time," he said to her. "Then I'll kill you. Give me the box." She weighed the chances. What had she left to lose? "Say please," she said. He regarded her quizzically, a soft growl in his throat. Then, polite as a calculating child, he said, "Please?" The word was her cue. She threw the box at the window with all the strength that her trembling arm possessed. It sailed past Frank's head, shattering the glass, and disappeared from sight. "No!" he shrieked, and was at the window in a heartbeat. "No, no, no!" She raced to the door, her legs threatening to fail her at every step. Then she was out onto the landing. The stairs almost defeated her, but she clung to the banister like a geriatric and made it to the hallway without failing. Above, there was further din. He was calling after her again, but this time she would not be caught. She fled along the hallway to the front door and flung it open. The day had brightened since she'd first entered the house, a defiant burst of sunlight before the evening fell. Squinting against the glare, she started down the pathway. There was glass underfoot, and amongst the shards, her weapon. She picked it up, a souvenir of her defiance, and ran. As she reached the street proper, words began to come. A helpless babble, fragments of things seen and felt. But Lodovico Street was deserted, so she began to run, and kept running until she had put a good distance between her and the bandaged beast. Eventually, wandering on some street she didn't recognize, someone asked her if she needed help. The little kindness defeated her, for the effort in making some coherent reply to the inquiry was simply too much, and her exhausted mind lost its hold on the light. The horror of situations like this often comes not for those doing the betraying, you see, but for those who witness it. Mens rea, after all, is a component of evil action. Stay scary, wildlings. Learn to recognize when curiosity is going too far, lest you end up like the famous cat, and make the most of your nights.